Um, so I think the time remaining, I want to just share with you some anecdotes and then have you respond to them in terms of the anecdotes you'll see are illustrative of, I think you'll find them interesting. I don't know where to begin. Yeah. What?
I was going to say, is this a pause moment?
Pause moment?
Yeah.
No, no, it's okay. I'm going to find ways to. I had a partner in my, I've always worked with partners in different places, and one of the interesting things about peace and conflict resolution in terms of interreligious work is that at every step of the way, you're often building bridges that there are conflicts within conflicts within conflicts. And so, and I'm sure a lot of you who've done work in the field have experienced this, that even within a single NGO, part of engaging in conflict resolution with somebody over there or being the in-between person is that you have to work out all the sub-conflicts that are going on, sometimes within your own group. It's for people who like conflict analysis, it's endlessly interesting to just piece through the dynamics of how the sub-conflicts often are more important than the bigger conflict. So that the work I was doing in the Middle East with my partner, I had a Christian partner, and he was sponsored by a particular Christian group, or mostly Christian group, that you've studied before here. I'm not going to say which one, but it was one of the case studies. And I'll call him. Where
from the switch?
Bob.
I'll call him.
Fred.
I'll call him Bob. And
What about Bob?
what?
Tell us about Bob. What about Bob?
What about Bob? Right. And so Bob and I traveled together. We had a friendship going back a number of years. And the interesting thing is that he had worked on building a relationship between me and his fellow Christians, on them becoming more comfortable with a Jewish person. But we were partners in working in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine. So the double dynamic here is that he and I had already gone through a long process for years, and it was still ongoing, on Jewish-Christian relations, and also European-Jewish relations, because he was European. And at the same time, we were dealing with the most difficult topic that actually was kind of avoided by his group. And in fact, his group tentatively was trying to invite Jews in to participate in things at the same time that things were getting worse and worse on the ground in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have to remember that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much also a Jewish-Christian-Muslim conflict. Okay, where Christians are solidly on one side in terms of the actual participants in the conflict over the land, even though there's a whole side to the Christian world that is wildly pro-Israel and pro-Jewish. This particular group was not of that nature. They had had a lot of relationships with Arabs from around, Arab Christians and Arab Muslims to a degree, around the Middle East for over 50 years, and had actually avoided Israeli contact, Israeli-Jewish contact, or had very little of it. So there was obviously, there was a dynamic already of difficulties over this whole Jewish-Christian relationship, the legacy of Europe, and yet we were the partners to go and try and help Jews and Palestinians, transform their relationship. So Bob and I went together on a couple of trips, and we had some really good times. We also fought all the time, and sometimes we're both very sensitive, We were in this because of very strong passions about violence and cruelty and compassion. And at the same time, we're very, very sensitive to conflict, very sensitive to insult and hurt. So, at one point, the methodology, and for those of you in conflict resolution, the methodology here was utterly different than what NGOs really often do. NGOs will go into a place and they will they'll set up a dialogue or they'll set up a joint project. This place, these people didn't do that at all. What they did was build friendships. And they never knew where the friendships were going to go. And everything was about the friendships. Okay? You may be able to start getting which group I'm talking about from the case studies. And the friendships had an air of divine providence about them. Does everybody know what divine providence means from theology? Anybody want to say what is divine providence, Wayne?
Well, it's predestination almost. It's been planned by God almost in advance. And serendipitously things happen that God wants to happen.
Right. So that's a basic religious instinct in many parts of the world, that when something happens, it's divine. It's meant to be. And a lot of people look for signs. And this isn't just Abrahamic. It's both, I mean, it's Wicca religion, it's all sorts of religions seem to focus on paying attention to what's happening and to see, is there a divine sign here? So that means that all of your meetings have significance. All accidents are not accidents. Now, Bob was more of a science type, and he didn't buy into that completely, but he did have a strong spiritual side. And I also, I mean, I have a very strong scientific bent. I'm not I really am anti-fundamentalist in many ways in my orientation. But I'm not averse to thinking that there's something very useful about chaos and about what's unpredictable, which would drive a rational approach to conflict resolution crazy. But I'm very interested in accidents. I'm very interested in how things evolve. So, I don't remember how I ended up with this rabbi friend, this Rabbi F, I'll call him, who was completely out of the box in terms of conflict resolution or peacemaking. He had been a founder of a radical movement in Israel. He was a messianic kind of person. He was focused on how to most quickly bring the Messiah. He was surrounded by people who were rather otherworldly. They're praying for people all the time, but he makes the leap to start praying for his enemies too. And so he's part of this circle of Jews and Arabs who are praying and healing people on both sides of the conflict in the West Bank. Now the West Bank is a place where the liberal Jews who are pro-peace would never go because they feel it's an illegal occupation. This should be the place where you can partition and have a real Palestine. But these other kind of Jews, they actually live there. So the irony of this, of conflicts within conflicts, is that we're dealing with a rabbi type who believes that this is sacred, holy Jewish land. But every human being is sacred and holy, and who's reaching out to Muslims and Christians, but in particular Muslims, more than most of the liberals are, at all. The liberals don't have direct contact with Palestinians. He does all the time. In fact, he's reaching out to the most extreme Muslims, to Hamas. And in the context of Israeli security and Israeli psychology, he can get away with it more because he's been part of the occupation, because he's proved himself in being part of, really committed to Zionism. So he gets away with something, and they think he's crazy, but they let him do it. They don't see him as a traitor. So here we are involved with him, and he happens to have a friend who is the head of a security service in Palestine. He's Colonel, we'll call him Colonel N. And he, for one reason or another, again because of these messianic inclinations. He met me, he heard about me, and he sees me as the avenue to influence on Washington. And so Bob and I come, and he wants us to help and observe with different meetings. And so he decides that there's going to be a meeting between him and Colonel M in Jerusalem. Now this is at a time when there's a fair amount of violence going on. It's not total war. It's before the outbreak no, maybe it was starting in the middle of the Intifada, the second Intifada. And it's not legal exactly for this colonel to get into Israel. He's Palestinian. I once asked this colonel, I said, the first thing, and it seems to have a strong impact, but I feel there's a lot of historical amnesia in conflicts. People don't ask about where you come from. That's a sensitive question. I always ask, because I want to know people's history. I want to know where they come from. So I asked this colonel the first time I met him, I said, where do you come from? So he told me some, refugee camp in Palestine. I said, no, where do you come from? So then he told me, where he had been, where he had come from in mainland Israel before 1948. I think it was Rishon LeZion or Rehovot. And I said, that wasn't the Arab names, but those were the Jewish names. And I said to him, well, have you been back at all? So he looked at me slyly and he said, not officially. Which meant that at various points he'd infiltrated. Because he was part of the Palestinian forces. So all those years before they had come back to Palestine, they were involved in guerrilla warfare and infiltrations and reconnaissance and all these things. So it was dealing with a rabbi on the one side who had been part of the Israeli army, very high up connections, and then on the other side, a colonel in Arafat's armed forces, very high up. Now, Bob and I end up in this situation, and we don't know a whole lot from these characters, but we have our own instincts. And Rabbi M invites the colonel to come unofficially to Jerusalem. Now, here's the irony: this rabbi has no resources. He has no economic resources. He borrows cab fare. He has none of the assets that the high-powered people have in Israel, but he has a lot of attention. And so he didn't have any place to put them. So they come, and we were going to end up meeting in a lobby in a Jerusalem hotel. So this is one of my first experiences in an actual encounter between real enemies from two sides in the middle of a conflict. So on the one hand, my antennas were all up on saying, this isn't exactly a smart place to meet. But on the other hand, I'm a guest. I'm a third party. So my general instinct as a third party is to just go along, because I'm there as largely as an observer. Comes to the hotel. We're waiting for this colonel to come. He comes with his assistants. He's in plain clothes, obviously not in military uniform. And he was visibly uncomfortable. And I think he assumed there was going to be a room. And there wasn't a room. So we start gathering around these big chairs. You know how in hotels they have these big chairs that you can lounge in? We start gathering around 6 of these into a circle in the middle of the lobby. And so he and his assistant are sitting there, and there's Bob and me, and then this rabbi. And this rabbi looks like a rabbi. He's got a long beard and everything, He's just really looks strange to Israelis even. And he's talking, and then these two obviously, Arab men, and then us 2 white boys from the United States, and talking rather loudly, and these 2 are very uncomfortable. We saw that they were uncomfortable, but the rabbi didn't see it. He just sort of was making theater. Within a half hour of the conversation, or maybe 20 minutes, we were surrounded by people with earpieces, security services. And you just didn't know what to do. And I mean, this is the middle of a conflict. And you just had this, thing. So it broke up. They left because it wasn't any point in continuing. Everything was being monitored, and they were uncomfortable. And Bob and I did a lot of reflection afterwards on this. And we both came to the conclusion that whatever the talents of this rabbi, and he is very talented, and however much he loved this man, and they had a very close relationship, that moment in itself was a moment of indignity. That it wasn't honorable. And in fact, it may have been dangerous. And so we decided that as third parties, we weren't going to say that, and we'd never say anything against the rabbi. We'd never say anything to anybody, but we were going to do something, which is something that we weren't exactly comfortable doing, or I wasn't. And that is that we were going to go into Gaza at the invitation he did invite us, the invitation of this colonel, who was the head of the security service, as a statement to go into his world. And I have to tell you, with my background, I was absolutely terrified. And getting across the border is very complicated. I walked across. You're walking with these huge barriers, and you're just walking completely isolated across the crossing. I had no idea what was going to be on the other side. And I was fortunate enough, once we got on the other side, that there were drivers. And the driver from the police drivers were driving, they were driving around Gaza at 100 miles an hour on these dirt roads. It was but it was an amazing experience for me, spiritually, to feel safe finally when I was in a police car from Palestinians. In other words, you go through levels and levels of fear and insecurity. And a very powerful aspect of this work, when you build friendships, is the fact that you're completely vulnerable. And you feel safe at various points with your enemy. Because it's better than not being with anybody. It's much better than being in between a crossing, or in situations where you don't know what's going to happen next. But suddenly you're in a car and you feel safe. You're safe with your adversary. But it's because it's an adversary that you know. So we went, and sure enough, we go into this place, and this colonel, he had a feast for us. It was the size of a table, almost like the middle here. Every kind of delicacy you can imagine, right in the middle of Gaza. And he insisted that we eat this lunch. And he didn't eat because it was a fast day for him. It wasn't Ramadan. I don't know what he was fasting on. But he was one of the only people in Arafat's forces who was a very pious Muslim. He also was one of the people who has stood up to Hamas. In other words, he's part of, this is why it's so important to understand the difference between religious Islam and political Islam. There's a lot of religious Muslims who are against political Islam. People don't realize that. So, the reason why Bob and I went was to make up, or to do penance, for the way in which he was embarrassed. But we never said a word about the incident because it would have been humiliating to even talk about it. And that created a very powerful relationship between him and us that eventually would lead to our meeting with Arafat. But we had established our relationship that day. And it had to be based on risks. He took risks coming to us. We took risks coming to him. His hospitality, I think we knew instinctually that his hospitality would be head and shoulders over what happened in Jerusalem. Because our instincts in this conflict is that there's good and bad on both sides. There are cultural tendencies of the Jewish part of this conflict and cultural tendencies of the Arab part. And honestly speaking, both of those cultural tendencies have some elements that make this conflict continue. In other words, there are certain aspects of the Arab cultural contribution to this conflict that are defeatist, and there are certain Jewish aspects that are defeatist. And it was, at least in this encounter, it was clear to me that whatever other tendencies there are to want peace or to work for peace or to reach out to adversaries. And there really is, there are a tremendous amount of Israeli Jews who have aggressively reached out to Palestinians in the last 30 years and have tried to create partnerships. And because Israel is more of a democracy, it has been possible for them to freely create non-governmental agencies in a way that it wasn't as possible for people in the Arab world to respond. So on the one hand, Israel had done a tremendous amount of harm against Palestinians, but on the other hand, average Israeli citizens had more freedom to sort of go against the trend and reach out to the other. On the other hand, there was far less of a expertise or a moral sensibility about how to do it. Because the invitation to Jerusalem was authentic, but a hotel lobby, it was outrageous. Gaza was far more of a mess than Jerusalem, far more dangerous, but the hospitality was incredible. Typical of the Arab-Israeli conflict. See what I'm saying? In other words, Gaza is 10 times more dangerous. In other words, there's too much violence, internal and external, and at the same time, a far greater wisdom around what it is to have a guest, how it is that you treat somebody. Jerusalem, far more peaceful, far more safe, but it wasn't successful because there wasn't that sensitivity. And then there's the third parties. It was us. There's American Jew and American Christian, trying to figure out, well, what is our contribution here? It wasn't to criticize anybody. It was to simply try to be a linkage and to try and heal some of the things that may have not gone right.
How long did this whole scenario last? How long did
That was within a matter of 4 or 5 days between the first meeting and the second meeting, I believe. And it was nerve-wracking because we had to do it fairly close to when we were supposed to leave, so we could have got stuck in Gaza, not to mention killed. So that was nerve-wracking. We decided it was worth the risk. It was important. And then later trips would lead to much higher level meetings, where we really had some dramatic encounters that I describe in the books. But I want to share with you one more piece of this anecdote in terms of the conflict between me and Bob that we argue about to this day in terms of trying to deconstruct it. We fought a lot. We fought a lot about, I guess, competing victims or who was more injured and what was more dangerous. And I remember one time, and I write about this in my Healing the Heart of Conflict book. We're driving in the West Bank at night, in the dark, and it was East Jerusalem, but it was far out in the suburbs that are still officially called East Jerusalem, but there was really the West Bank, and there were no lights, and I was terrified. And Bob was saying, "Oh, it's just a night drive; it's fine," and he was making very little of my state of terror. And so we started having this huge fight because I said, "Bob, Jews have been kidnapped; they've been killed right here," and he just didn't get it. So these are the kind of dynamics that we were fighting about. Then we ended up having a problem with the car. Oh, he got lost. He got lost, and he stopped at this grocery store, and there are like 4 young guys outside. And of course, I'm in the car, and he says, "Oh, looks like fine young chaps." And he goes out and has a chat with them. And I was just boiled. I was terrifying. I was boiled. Now another time we had another problem with the car, but this time it was in a Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, far out. We also got lost, and it turned out to be an ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhood where everybody dresses in black. And we weren't lost. I was going to see a rather famous leader of one of the Hasidic groups that I had a connection to. And so he comes along on the trip, And we get into this neighborhood, and he's obviously extremely uncomfortable. I said to him, why don't you wait in the assembly room? There are people there, and he didn't want to go in. And apparently they asked him to come in twice or 3 times to have some tea. They were going to do their prayers while I was upstairs meeting with this leader. And it was very clear that he just did not want to go in. So I just let him have it. I said, these people have never killed anybody. They're not famous for killing anybody. Why are you afraid? But his fear was, as a Christian, with people with very strange clothing, who he clearly associates with something dark. And to this day, I haven't been able to convince him that he was afraid of them. And that they don't exactly go around, killing Christians. So we had this ongoing fight about which one of us and our fears were justified. Now, the reason why I share all this with you is that these 2 very vulnerable, imperfect people were the building blocks for some pretty extraordinary meetings that took place, that eventually would take place with other sheikhs and rabbis and with Arafat, and yet filled with our own fears and concerns. Unresolved issues for Bob with Jews, and unresolved issues for me with Christians. And that's part and parcel of how this is done. Now, how do you evaluate that? how do you evaluate the victories here, the losses, the victories, the repentance, the changes, all of that dynamic? So I asked that rhetorically, but that's one of our questions, is that we knew that at each and every step, it was our friendships that were leading to other friendships that were leading to other friendships that were leading to influencing leaders. On both sides, actually. Because we felt that we were influencing this rabbi who was speaking to very high-level people in the army and the military and the government, persuading them of certain things. I didn't tell you that I had knockdown, drag-out fights with this rabbi over a very interesting thing. I kept on arguing with him about the checkpoints. He kept saying to me the checkpoints weren't an important issue. I said they are an important issue. They are the place of humiliation or honor. It's either going to be a place of honor and respect in the borderline between enemies, or it's going to be a place of humiliation. So in the secular, rational processes, you tend to talk about either there should be checkpoints or not. But let's say people insist that there are checkpoints for security reasons. Does it have to be a place of humiliation? No, that's a choice. See, the use of policing is a universal need in human cultures. But does policing have to be a humiliation? That's a choice. And so I was arguing with him in the first year, saying, no, this is the issue. And I said, you have to talk to the military about this. And he said, this isn't important. And we would argue back and forth because he felt that everything was religious symbol, that religious symbols were important. I said, but this is an issue of spirituality, morality, of how people are treated at these critical moments. And so I come back a year later. In between, he had spoken to the military person I asked him to, and that military person swore at me and said, who is this American to tell us what to do? Called him. This high military commander was in charge of the checkpoints. So you understand that here where I was, building this crazy relationship, and you'd think it's crazy. They'd look at it at State Department and they say, this relationship has no consequence. But only because I prevailed upon him did he speak to the person making the decision about how the checkpoints are run. A year later, I come back, and the rabbi forgot completely what our arguments were, and he's complaining to me that nobody listens about the checkpoints. He forgot. He forgot that I had, so clearly he had gone through a transformation. It's not that you can have a nice ceremony over here and have a checkpoint. That the checkpoint is the place of test. It's just like in Washington, D.C. You can have a fancy thing at the Capitol, but if the police are brutalizing a particular group, what's the point of the fancy thing at the Capitol? It's the moment between power and powerlessness that's the test of a civilization. The moment between power and powerlessness is the test of a civilization. And if there's theater that reconfirms or affirms a benevolent relationship between the powerful and the less powerful, that's fine. But it's a theater of the absurd if it's mocked by reality. And I think that's where we evolved into a relationship between him and me,